Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It had been months since I'd accepted the invitation to stay at my friend Alex's family estate. Nestled high above a craggy coastline, the mansion loomed like a relic from another era, its weathered stone walls crumbling with age. The estate had belonged to Alex's family for generations, a place shrouded in old tales and secrets that no one dared speak of. Upon arriving, the house seemed both grand and desolate, perched atop jagged cliffs that stretched out over the endless expanse of the sea. The only sound was the rhythmic crash of waves far below, echoing through the hollow chambers of the estate. There were no nearby neighbors, no cell service, and no signs of life beyond the three of us. It felt like we had stepped into another time. The first night, we wandered through the vast halls, exploring the ancient rooms. Everything inside felt untouched by the modern world. Dusty chandeliers hung from high ceilings, faded tapestries adorned the walls, and creaking floorboards seemed to groan beneath our every step. Every corner of the mansion seemed to whisper secrets from a forgotten past. That night, we gathered by the fireplace in the grand lounge. Shadows danced on the walls, the faint scent of something musty lingering in the air. Alex, with his usual bravado, told us the stories he had heard as a child about this house, tales of the mysterious disappearances of servants, strange voices echoing from the empty rooms, and doors that would close on their own in the dead of night. We had laughed it off at the time, brushing them aside as old family folklore. But things began to feel off. Late that night, after we had retired to our respective rooms, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake a growing sense of unease. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the old mansion's stone walls. Suddenly, I thought I heard footsteps, faint, distant, echoing in the hallway outside. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, forcing my eyes shut, trying to dismiss the sound. But the footsteps persisted, soft and deliberate, growing louder with each passing moment. I listened, paralyzed with fear, as they moved closer, toward my door. The handle turned slowly, creaking as if something or someone was trying to open it. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. The door didn't open, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were right there, just beyond the threshold, before they faded into silence once more. Shaken, I stayed awake, the rest of the night clutching my blankets. The next morning, I found Alex and Emma in the dining room. Both were pale and clearly disturbed. "Did either of you hear that last night?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We did," Alex replied, his hands trembling slightly as he sipped from a cup of cold coffee. "But I don't know what it was." "We weren't alone," Emma added, her voice faint. "I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing something." The day passed in a haze of unease. We stayed close, never venturing far from each other, avoiding the isolated hallways and shadowed corners of the mansion. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind that rattled the windows sent chills down our spines. The sense of being watched was unbearable. By nightfall, exhaustion had overtaken us, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. As we gathered, once again in the lounge, we could feel it pressing against us, the feeling that something was waiting, watching. That night, something changed. At around midnight, we heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. But this time, they were different. They weren't distant, faint, or disembodied. They were right outside the door. Emma clutched my arm, her breath ragged. The doorknob twisted slowly, the metal groaning as if it were being forced open. We froze in place. Whatever was on the other side was here now, closer than we had ever imagined. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was human-shaped, but not quite human. Its eyes, hollow and empty, glowed faintly in the darkness. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't bound by the same rules as us. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. In that moment, I realized what had been haunting us. The house wasn't just old and abandoned. It was something else, entirely. The footsteps, the whispers, the oppressive sense of presence, they had all been signs of something far more sinister than we could have imagined. We didn't run. We couldn't. Our legs refused to move. The figure remained at the door, watching us with its hollow, soulless gaze. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The door shut with a soft, ominous click, leaving us trembling in the dark. We didn't sleep that night. We couldn't. When morning came, the mansion was quiet. No signs of the figure remained, but we knew, whatever it was still there, watching, waiting. And we knew we would never be truly alone in that house on the cliff. We always thought the old factory was abandoned. It stood at the edge of town, looming in the distance like a silent monument to forgotten industry. Once a hub of activity, it had fallen into disrepair years ago. The windows shattered and its metal framework rusted. The locals avoided it, rumors swirling about strange occurrences inside, but no one had dared venture close in years. One evening, my friends and I, 3 of us, decided to explore. We were bored, restless, and curious. The old factory loomed, far above the landscape, casting long shadows beneath its towering walls. It was eerie, the kind of place that seemed trapped in a forgotten past. We told ourselves it was just old, dilapidated, nothing more. As we approached, the silence was deafening. The air felt heavy, thick with something we couldn't quite identify. The closer we got, the colder the breeze seemed to grow, slipping through our jackets, turning our breath to mist. The factory itself was a maze of rusting metal and broken glass, debris scattered across the floor like forgotten relics of a time long gone. We made our way inside, stepping carefully over the rubble. The floor creaked underfoot, the echoes of our footsteps bouncing back at us, amplified by the emptiness. There was a lingering smell of decay and something else, something metallic, like old blood. We didn't pay it much attention at first, but then we began to notice strange sounds, faint, distant murmurs that seemed to come from deeper within. We stopped, our eyes scanning the dimness, our hearts thudding louder with each passing second. The factory was supposed to be abandoned after all. Emma whispered, "Did you hear that?" We nodded, uneasy, but brushed it off. We continued deeper, driven by a mix of curiosity and the hope of finding something hidden, something we couldn't explain. The deeper we went, the louder the murmuring became. It wasn't just voices anymore. It was laughter. Quiet at first, but growing, echoing off the steel walls, thin, hollow laughter that sent shivers down our spines. We could feel something watching us now. Ryan suddenly stopped, his face pale, as he pointed toward a corridor to the right. "Did you hear that?" His voice trembled. We strained to listen, the laughter now unmistakable, reverberating through the factory like a warning. "I'm not staying here," Emma said, her voice rising in panic. But as we turned to leave, the hallway behind us stretched unnaturally. The laughter seemed to ripple through the very air, reverberating louder, closer. Then we saw it. A figure. Faint, barely visible, drifting slowly toward us from the shadows. It wasn't human. Its face was obscured, but we could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and hollow. Its laughter echoed in the void as it drew nearer. We ran. There was no thought, just primal terror. We didn't look back, sprinting through the factory, our feet slipping on the broken floor, the laughter echoing behind us like a chorus of ghosts. The walls seemed to stretch, closing in, and we couldn't tell if we were running forward or circling endlessly. Somehow, we made it outside. The laughter faded, replaced by the oppressive silence of the night. We didn't speak. None of us dared. Look back at the factory. To this day, we haven't gone near that place again. The old factory stands as it did, silent and forgotten, but we know now. It's anything but abandoned. And we still hear the laughter sometimes in the quiet hours. Always. I always believed there was no place more haunted than an old house until it happened to me. It wasn't a cabin or a secluded forest retreat. No, it was a city apartment complex. New, modern, and seemingly ordinary. But something about my new place felt off. I moved into the city apartment 2 months ago, right after finishing college. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet, comfortable place where I could focus on my new job and independence. The building itself wasn't old, but it wasn't new either. A mid-century design, with a sterile beige exterior and faded brick, surrounded by other buildings that looked just as unremarkable. On the first night, everything was normal. The apartment was small but cozy. I unpacked, set up my desk, and settled into my bed. But that night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing faint sounds from beyond the walls. A faint creaking, almost like footsteps, but not quite. I dismissed it as the usual creaks of an old building settling. The next night, the sounds became more distinct. This time, it wasn't just creaking. It was whispering, soft, low murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I tried to convince myself it was just the building's old pipes settling, but the whispers didn't stop. They were insistent, as if someone was trying to speak directly to me. I couldn't make out what they were saying, though. It wasn't clear words, just distorted, slurred sounds. I tried to ignore it, but as the days passed, the whispers became louder and more persistent. They seemed to follow me, echoing in different parts of the apartment, always when I was alone. The real terror began a week into my stay. One night, after hearing the whispers growing louder again, I finally decided to confront whatever it was. I stood in the hallway, breathless, my pulse racing. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. My hands shook as I strained to hear anything beyond the walls, but there was nothing. For a moment, I thought the apartment had returned to normal. Then I felt it, breath on the back of my neck, cold, invisible, and unmistakable. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispering began again, this time louder, closer. It wasn't just in my ears, it was inside my head. I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep was impossible that night. The whispers continued, now a cacophony of distorted voices, some high-pitched, others guttural and low. It felt as though they were inside my skull, each one screaming silently, their distorted words echoing endlessly. Desperation set in. The next day, I tried to reach out to anyone, friends, neighbors, but they all dismissed my concerns. They couldn't hear the whispers. They couldn't see the shadows I swore were lurking at the edges of my vision. Weeks passed in this torment. Every night the whispers grew louder, and each day my paranoia deepened. I started noticing strange things. Faint silhouettes in the corners of my apartment. Dark shapes that would flicker when I turned to look. But they weren't solid. They were hollow, void-like, always lurking just beyond my sight. Then came the night when everything changed. I awoke suddenly, gasping for breath. The apartment was pitch black, the only light from the street lamp outside. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't respond. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to scream. In the dark, I heard them again, closer now. The whispers had turned into screams, a chorus of distorted voices screaming my name. It felt as though they were inside my mind, tearing at my thoughts. I could feel their presence surrounding me, as if they were pressing against my skin. Suddenly, the air shifted, and the temperature dropped drastically. I could feel the breath again, cold, heavy, on my neck. A whisper came so close it felt as though it was inside my very skull. Get out. I didn't wait. Somehow, I managed to force my body to move. I ran, stumbling into the hallway, tears streaming down my face. The front door slammed open, and I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was out of the building, gasping for air, the sounds still reverberating in my head. The apartment remains empty now. I can't bring myself to return, and I doubt I ever will. Whatever was there, the whispers, the shadows, the presence, I can't explain it, but I know one thing for certain. Some places leave a mark, and that apartment was one of them. I survived, but the echoes of that night haunt me. I hear the whispers in my dreams, sometimes in waking moments, as if they're still searching, still waiting. Whatever they were, they're not gone, and neither am I. It was supposed to be a routine trip, just a weekend getaway for some fresh air and a break from the chaos of everyday life. My friends and I decided to visit an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. Rumors swirled around. The place for years, but no one could verify if they were true or not. Abandoned factories are always eerie, but this one had a reputation that made people shiver. We wanted to see if the stories were more than just hearsay. The factory loomed over us like a rusted giant, towering and silent. Its crumbling facade was marked with faded graffiti and the shattered remains of windows. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the kind that settles into the cracks of old metal and concrete. We explored cautiously, stepping over piles of debris and broken machinery. The echoes of our footsteps seemed to stretch endlessly through the empty spaces. First, there was nothing unusual, just the creaking of metal, the groans of the building settling on its foundation. But as we moved deeper into the facility, that eerie silence started to feel oppressive. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural. No wind, no distant sounds from the city beyond the factory walls. Around midday, we stumbled upon a room filled with old radio equipment. The walls were covered in wires, faded dials, and cobwebbed microphones. It was like something out of a bygone era, untouched since the factory's last days of operation. Something about it felt strange. Like this room had been waiting for us. Ryan, always the curious one, decided to tinker with the equipment. After fiddling with the old radio, a faint static hiss began to crackle from the speakers. At first, we ignored it, thinking it was just interference. But then, the static gave way to a voice, thin and trembling, as if it had been trapped there for decades. "Is anyone out there?" the voice asked. We froze. None of us had touched the radio itself, yet it seemed to be broadcasting. "Who's there?" Ryan asked, his voice shaky. There was no reply, only more static. But then, after a long silence, the voice returned, this time clearer, more insistent. "I've been waiting. Please, someone. Help." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. No one spoke. We all exchanged wide-eyed glances. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. "Where are you?" Emma whispered. The response came as a whisper, almost lost in the static. "The factory. The broadcast is the only way. Please, help me." Ryan, still shaken, tried to speak again, but the radio cut him off. "Turn back. Don't stay here," the voice begged, its tone now desperate. "Please, leave, before it's too late." None of us knew what to make of it. Was it a prank? Some malfunction? But something about that voice didn't feel like a joke. The desperation in it was real. Far too real. "We should leave," I suggested, my voice trembling. But Emma hesitated, staring at the radio as if something was about to happen. "I think," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's trying to tell us something." That's when the static returned, louder this time, distorted. The voice was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling hum that vibrated through the speakers. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on us. Something moved in the corner of the room, a shadow, shifting and slithering like smoke. We all turned to face it, but there was nothing there. Yet we knew something was watching us, something far beyond our comprehension. Fearing whatever presence had been trapped with that voice, we decided to leave. The radio was still broadcasting static as we fled the factory, but we didn't dare look back. Once we were outside, the oppressive silence of the factory gave way to the distant sounds of the city. None of us spoke much on the way home. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The voice, though distant, still echoed in my mind. Days passed, but the memory of that broadcast haunted us. We tried to dismiss it, thinking maybe it was some kind of prank or a malfunction. But then, several weeks later, I received a message from an unknown number. It simply read, "Help us. The broadcast never stops. I haven't answered. I don't know if I ever will." It started with a simple invitation, a remote retreat in the mountains. My friend Sam had stumbled upon an old, secluded villa nestled high in the peaks. The idea was to escape the noise of the city, unwind in a place untouched by modern life. Sam had promised us peace, solitude, and breathtaking views. The villa was hidden away, accessible only via a winding, treacherous road that spiraled up the mountainside. When we finally reached the top, the place looked as though it had been forgotten by time. The grand structure was centuries old, its faded exterior barely visible through the thick fog that had rolled in. Large, ivy-covered windows glared like hollow eyes, watching as we approached. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The furniture was old and moth-eaten, and cobwebs clung to every corner. There were no modern amenities, no Wi-Fi, no cell signal. It felt like we had stepped into a different era entirely. But we brushed it off, thinking of it as part of the charm. That night, as we sat around the fireplace, the silence became oppressive. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. It was peaceful at first, but then something changed. We started hearing faint whispers, soft murmurs carried by the wind. They were too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from the hallways, from behind the closed doors. Each time we opened a door to investigate, there was nothing but emptiness. We joked that it was just the old house settling, but the whispering only grew louder. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Maybe our minds were playing tricks on us. But the next night, the whispers became more distinct. They weren't just murmurs. They were voices, muffled, distorted, like they were speaking a language we couldn't understand. The voices seemed to come from every direction, sometimes whispering in unison, other times fragmented and disjointed. Sam went to bed early, exhausted. From the long drive, leaving me and Emma to stay up by the fire, we tried to ignore the unsettling sound, but it was impossible. The whispers filled the entire house, echoing through the hallways. I swear I could feel them breathing down my neck. Then, at some point, the whispers changed. They began speaking, my name. Soft, almost loving, the way someone might whisper to a child in the dark. I froze, the chill of fear racing up my spine. Emma heard it too, her face pale and trembling as she clung to my arm. We moved closer to each other, but the voices grew louder. Not just my name, but others. Names I didn't recognize. They seemed to be coming from the other side of a door, at the end of the hall, the only door that remained locked. "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, my heart thudding in my chest. The whispers didn't stop. They echoed endlessly until we couldn't ignore them anymore. Finally, driven by a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity, I approached the door. My hand trembled as I placed it on the knob, turned it slowly, and pushed. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The whispers came from below. They seemed to beckon us, urging us to follow. My legs felt frozen. but Emma grabbed my hand and tugged me forward. We couldn't fight the pull. As we descended, the air grew colder. The whispers became clearer, more insistent. I could now make out fragments. "Come to us," they whispered. "We've been waiting." At the bottom, we found ourselves in a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with portraits, faces with hollow eyes that seemed to follow us as we walked. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, the corridor opened up into a vast, ancient hall. It was like something out of a nightmare. Rows of long wooden tables covered in rotting food and dust. At the far end, we saw figures seated in shadows, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They didn't move, but the whispers seemed to come from them, filling the room like a chorus. The moment we stepped into the hall, the whispers ceased. The air grew still, suffocating. The figures remained seated, their heads bowed. We stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, one by one, they raised their heads, their hollow eyes fixed on us. In that instant, I knew. The whispers had been them, waiting. The last thing I saw were those empty, lifeless eyes staring straight at me as we ran back up the stairs, the whispers echoing once more behind us. We made it out of the villa, but we didn't speak of what we saw. The memories haunt us still, the echoes of those whispers following us wherever we go. Something followed us from that place, something that remains in the shadows, waiting, always waiting. We were in the middle of the city, in an old, decrepit apartment complex that loomed over the skyline like a forgotten relic of another time. The building had long since been abandoned, its windows dark and its corridors hollow. It was the kind of place you passed by and never gave a second thought to. But curiosity got the better of us one night. It wasn't just any curiosity. It was the kind that gnawed at the edges of your sanity, the kind that made you ignore the warnings you didn't want to believe. There were stories, of course, rumors that circulated among the city's underground explorers, tales of strange noises, shadowy figures, and doors that opened on their own. But no one had dared venture inside in years. It was just me and two friends, Mark and Sarah, who decided we'd push past the fear and see for ourselves. The complex had long since fallen into disrepair. The once vibrant neighborhood around it, now a blur of urban decay. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of streetlight that barely lit the way. We entered the building cautiously, the smell of damp concrete and mildew hitting us immediately. The hallways were dark, with peeling paint and broken tiles crunching underfoot. The faintest creak echoed through the silence as we made our way up the stairs. It wasn't the sound of someone else. There was no one else. We were alone, but it didn't feel that way. Every corner seemed to hide something, some distorted reflection in a broken mirror, a shadow that didn't quite belong. The further we went, the more oppressive the silence became. Our breaths felt too loud, too unnatural, and we kept our voices to a whisper. When we reached the 5th floor, we stopped. The hallway stretched out before us, its dim light casting long, wavering shadows. We hadn't expected to find anything particular on this floor, but it felt different, heavier. The silence seemed to press against us, each step more difficult than the last. And then we heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from around us, but inside our heads. A voice, distorted and indistinct, muttering things we couldn't quite understand. We exchanged uneasy glances, hearts pounding. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark and Sarah nodded, their faces pale. We didn't speak again, but the whispers didn't stop. They swirled around us, words we couldn't comprehend, as if they were coming from within the walls themselves. As we moved down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from one direction. They were all around us, as though the very walls were alive, breathing, whispering. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Suddenly, one of the doors at the end of the hallway creaked. Open. No wind, no breeze, just open. It wasn't like the others. This one seemed deliberate, as if it had been waiting for us. Without thinking, we moved toward it. The air grew colder, and the whispers became a faint chanting, echoing off the walls. Mark pushed the door open further, revealing what looked like a long abandoned apartment. The furniture was overturned, covered in dust, and the room smelled like something had died there. Rotting wood, mildew, and decay. But what caught our attention wasn't the room itself, but the figure standing at the far end. It wasn't human. At least, not in the way we knew. It was tall, gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, like they didn't belong. Its head tilted as we entered, and though it didn't speak, we could feel its gaze boring into us. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence, as if the world had stopped turning. I felt something twist inside me, an unbearable pressure, like my chest might collapse at any moment. Mark and Sarah were frozen, staring at the figure. I could see the fear in their eyes. "Run," I heard myself say, but it wasn't my voice. It echoed in my head, louder than ever before. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. We ran. We sprinted down the hall, the oppressive silence broken only by our footsteps. The door slammed behind us, but we didn't stop to check if it had closed all the way. We fled down the stairs, past the shadows, the whispers, and the figure that seemed to follow us through every turn, every creaking floorboard. When we emerged into the night air, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. We didn't dare look. Back at the apartment, at the building that had tried to consume us, the whispers still echoed in my mind. A constant hum of words I couldn't make sense of. Whatever we encountered that night isn't gone. It's still with us, watching, waiting, silent and ever-present. And the apartment? It still stands there, empty and cold, waiting for someone else to enter. We survived, but I don't know if we were meant to. It was an old, abandoned factory on the edge of town. Not a place many people dared go. My friends and I had always been curious, but no one in town had been inside for years. The factory stood at the outskirts, shrouded in overgrown weeds and tangled metal. The windows were cracked and the once bold graffiti now faded and peeling. It wasn't the kind of place you would stumble upon by accident. It felt hidden, as though the town itself had forgotten it existed. We didn't plan on staying long, just a quick look inside to satisfy our curiosity. My friends, Jason, Rachel, and I, were eager to see what was left of the old place. It wasn't the typical abandoned factory either. Something about the building felt off, like it had never been entirely empty. The front door creaked as we pushed it open. Dust drifted in the air and the faint smell of metal and decay hit us immediately. The floors were covered in grime and debris, and broken machinery loomed in the corners, casting long, distorted shadows. The place seemed vast, too big for what we knew the factory to have produced. "This place feels different from the stories," Rachel said, her voice low. "I thought it was just an old factory, but I don't know." "I know what you mean," I replied, stepping further in. The air felt thick, heavy, almost as if it had weight. Jason nodded, staying silent as we explored deeper. That's when we heard it. The faintest sound, like whispers carried by the wind. We paused, glancing at each other, unsure if we had heard anything at all. The factory was silent again. "Must be the wind," Jason said, breaking the silence, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We pressed on, following the faint trail of flickering light from broken windows. The further we went, the quieter the building seemed. It was as if the walls themselves absorbed sound, and the darkness pressed in around us. Time felt warped in that space. Minutes turned into hours without us noticing. Suddenly, we heard it again, only this time, louder. A low whisper, distant at first, but growing clearer. I tried to dismiss it, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere. My heart started to race. Jason froze in place, his expression tense. "It's not the wind," Rachel whispered. "Where's it coming from?" The whispers grew more distinct, forming words, though they were unintelligible at first. But then they began to sound like voices, multiple indistinct murmurs blending together. The more we listened, the clearer they became. "Help. Help us. Leave. Don't stay." The voices weren't speaking in any language we could recognize. They were haunting, distorted, as though they were trying to tell us something. Something we couldn't grasp. The lights from the windows flickered erratically. Shadows began to move again, blurred shapes dancing across the walls. It was as if the factory itself was alive, breathing, shifting. The ground beneath our feet felt colder, and the whispers became louder, more desperate. "We need to get out of here," Jason muttered, his voice cracking. His flashlight trembled in his hand. As we turned to leave, the whispers turned into something darker, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from deep within the factory. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, twisting and contorting into forms that we couldn't quite see. The air grew colder still, and the growl deepened into a roar. Suddenly, we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing there, just more shadows, shifting, always just out of sight. "Run!" Rachel screamed, and we didn't hesitate. We bolted toward the door, our footsteps pounding against the creaking floor. The whispers followed us, louder than ever. They seemed to be all around, surrounding us, closing in. We didn't look back. The door swung open, letting in the harsh light of the outside world. We stumbled into the darkness of the factory grounds, our breaths ragged. The voices faded behind us, but the echoes of them lingered. The factory stood silent once more. Empty. Forgotten. But we knew something had followed us. Something that was never supposed to be found. We never went back. And we never will. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. I was house-sitting for an old friend, just a routine task. The house was in a quiet suburb, nothing unusual about it. My friend had asked me to stay for a few days while they were out of town, and the idea of having a large, empty house all to myself seemed like a peaceful escape from the usual noise of the city. The house wasn't particularly old, but it had a strange, faded charm. The walls were lined with family photos that had begun to yellow with age, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. It was well kept, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The silence was too heavy, too deliberate, as if the house was holding its breath. On the first night, I kept the lights on. The silence felt oppressive, and I couldn't bring myself to wander through the darkened hallways. But by the second night, curiosity got the better of me. The house felt strangely familiar, like I had been there before, though I knew I hadn't. As I roamed through the dimly lit rooms, I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. Every corner I turned seemed just a little too shadowy. That's when I noticed the whispers. They started faint, barely audible, like they were carried on the wind. I figured it was just the house settling, but as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls, but whenever I pressed my ear to them, they stopped. It was as if the house itself was trying to speak, only to fall silent when I paid attention. By the third night, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. They echoed through the house, now distinct words, soft, chilling, and indecipherable. I kept moving from room to room, but no matter how far I walked, they followed. It felt as though the house had come alive, consumed by some unseen force. Then, around midnight, the lights flickered and died. Panic shot through me as I realized the house was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but my signal was gone. I was cut off from the world. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. I stood frozen, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps weren't like any I'd ever heard. No one walks like that. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was making those sounds didn't have legs. The pacing grew louder, closer. Then a knock. Just one, but it wasn't at the door. Came from inside the walls. A hollow knock, repeated over and over as though someone was trapped behind them, trying to escape. My blood ran cold as I backed away, feeling trapped and surrounded by darkness. I didn't know how long I stood there, but soon the whispers became more than just disembodied sounds. They were calling to me. They seemed to come from all around, each word spoken clearer than before. "Let us out," they pleaded. "Please, help us." In a moment of sheer terror, I bolted for the front door. I didn't care about the force keeping me there. I had to escape. But as I unlocked the door and pushed it open, I realized it wasn't my front door. The house I was standing in wasn't the one I had entered. I had stepped into a house identical to the one I had come from. Same layout, same old photos on the walls. But something was different. The air was colder, the silence deeper, and the whispers had followed me, now louder and more desperate. I didn't dare go back inside. Instead, I ran into the night, my breath clouding in the freezing air. The whispers still echo in my mind. Each word burned into my memory. And even though I made it out, I know the house isn't done with me. Sometimes I hear those whispers in my sleep. They're never far. They're still calling. It was just another late shift at the old office building. I worked as a security guard, tasked with patrolling the vast, dimly lit halls of a towering skyscraper in the middle of the city. The building had been empty for years, its windows dark and vacant. My shift started at midnight, and the solitude was always oppressive. I was used to the silence, but tonight felt different. The city was distant, barely visible beyond the thick glass of the high-rise. No cars passed, no lights flickered in the surrounding streets. It was as if the entire world had gone to sleep. I checked my phone. No signal. The usual hum of the city had faded completely. Around 1 a.m., something changed. I heard it first, a iki, faint whisper carried through the air like a sigh. I froze. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the ventilation system, but it wasn't coming from the usual source. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, echoing off the empty office walls as if they were coming from inside, the building itself. At first, I assumed it was just the building settling, but the voices didn't seem to belong to any natural source. They were disjointed, fractured, as if they were fragments of conversations I couldn't understand. I strained to make out the words, but they blurred together into an incomprehensible murmur. Around 2 a.m., the lights flickered. Just once. A sharp, sudden blink that cast everything into eerie shadows. It lasted only a second, but the sensation it left behind lingered. I knew I was alone in the building, yet the air seemed thick, like something, or someone, was watching me from the corners of the rooms. The whispers turned darker. They weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, distorted and echoing, rising, from the shadows that lined the hallways. They called out to me. Not with words, but with sounds too inhuman to recognize. My heart pounded, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen as they swirled around me, more insistent, more real than they had been just moments before. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but something felt wrong. I checked the security cameras. The building appeared empty, but the static on the monitors wasn't just visual. It felt alive. A dark shape lingered at the edge of the screen, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I stared harder, but the image flickered and vanished. The whispers turned to laughter. cold, hollow laughter that seemed to come from all around me. I covered my ears, but it was inside my head now. The walls seemed to pulse, vibrating with the unnatural sound. My breath came shallow, and I realized I wasn't breathing properly. Suddenly, I heard a soft, deliberate knock on the office door. A single knock. I jerked around, my pulse racing. The building had no one but me. Yet I knew someone, or something, was on the other side. Another knock, louder this time. I stumbled toward the door, my mind screaming to get away, but my legs refused to move. The whispers grew deafening, echoing through my skull. "Run!" they hissed. Tears blurred my vision as I reached out for the door handle. My fingers trembled, and as I turned it, I felt a chill seep through my palm. The door swung open, and there was nothing but darkness beyond. I hesitated, heart pounding in my chest. A breath escaped me, ragged and trembling. The hallway was empty. No one was there. Yet, I knew they were watching from the void. I slammed the door shut and didn't stop running. I left the building and didn't look back, not until I was far from that cursed place. The whispers still haunt me, still echo in my mind, in quiet moments when I think I'm alone. I survived that night. But something followed me. Something isn't finished yet. It was just another ordinary Saturday, or at least I thought it would be. I decided to spend the day exploring the old, forgotten part of town that no one really visited anymore. The streets were lined with buildings that had long since fallen into disrepair, their facades cracked and faded from years of neglect. Nobody seemed to come here anymore, which was exactly why I wanted to see it. I wandered aimlessly, the silence enveloping me like a thick, oppressive fog. The air smelled stale, full of dust and decay. Most of the windows in the buildings were shattered, letting in the muted light of the day that barely managed to penetrate the grime. There was an unsettling stillness, a quiet that felt almost alive. I tried to push away the creeping sense of discomfort, reminding myself that it was just an old part of town, nothing more. As I walked, I came across an old bookstore, its window cracked and its door hanging loosely on one hinge. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and mildew. Dust covered every surface and cobwebs stretched from the corners of the ceiling. The place was like a museum, untouched by time. I wandered between the shelves, the weight of the silence pressing on my shoulders. The only sound was the soft shuffle of my footsteps on the creaking floorboards. Every so often, I'd hear a faint creak or the distant echo of my own breathing, but that was all. It felt like I had stepped into a world that had long since forgotten life. Suddenly, something shifted in the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A whispering sound echoed through the empty space, quiet and subtle. I turned around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing, just more rows of old, dusty books. "Hello." My voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the silence. No response. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight flickering as I moved deeper into the store. The whispering came again, louder this time, like a breath on the back of my neck. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second I thought I saw something move, a shadow at the end of the aisle. I followed the beam of light, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The store was filled with rows upon rows of books, each one older than the last. The whispering continued, low and haunting, as if it were coming from the depths of the building itself. I walked toward the back of the store, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The whispers grew louder, now more like faint murmurs, as though something was speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened as I realized the sound wasn't coming from a book, or the wind, or anything tangible. Then I saw it. A figure, faint, barely visible in the dim light. It stood near the far wall, its form indistinct, almost transparent. My breath hitched, and my flashlight flickered once more, casting shadows that danced along the walls. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus of faint, distorted voices. I took a hesitant step toward it, my hand shaking as I tried to focus my flashlight. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. The figure vanished, as if it had never been there. My chest tightened as I searched the darkness, but there was nothing. The store felt colder now, empty in a way that felt almost unnatural. I decided to leave. I didn't care about the books anymore, or the eerie feeling that had taken over the space. I just wanted to get out. As I made my way to the front door, I could feel eyes watching me, following me. My footsteps quickened, the creaking floorboards beneath me sounding louder than they had all day. When I finally reached the door, I paused, one last glance over my shoulder, just to be sure I was alone. That's when I saw it. The figure again, just beyond the doorway, standing in the shadows. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt as though it could see straight through me. Then it was gone. I stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind me. The whispering was gone, replaced by silence once more. I didn't look back. I never went back to that bookstore, and I never will. Some places leave scars that can't be erased. It was just another evening walk through the woods, like countless others I'd taken before. My friends and I had made a habit of these late-night strolls, always curious about what lay beyond the edge of town. The woods were familiar to us, comforting even, filled with tall trees and the rustling of leaves. But that night was different. We set out just after dusk, the golden glow of the sunset fading behind us. The air was cool, crisp, and the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade away as we ventured deeper into the trees. The woods were quiet, too quiet. There was no laughter, no chirping of crickets, just silence. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet, though. It felt wrong. We walked on, joking and laughing, trying to shake off the oppressive atmosphere, but something was off, something I couldn't quite place. My friends seemed oblivious, lost in their chatter, but I felt the weight of the forest pressing down on me. As we pushed further, we came across an old, decaying wooden bench, rotted and covered in moss. It wasn't there on our previous walks, that much I was sure of. We decided to stop for a moment, stretching our legs, as if the bench had appeared there just for us. I sat down, resting my hands on my knees. The silence felt heavier now. I looked around, but there was no sign of the familiar paths we usually walked. The trees felt tighter, as if the woods were closing in. My stomach twisted. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. One of my friends, Jake, waved me off. "Come on, what's the rush? We've been here a dozen times, there's nothing different." But I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right. We continued walking, though my steps grew slower. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, and the usual landmarks, the twisted old tree, the hollowed-out log, were nowhere to be found. It was as if the forest had shifted, or we had. Then came the first sound that shattered the silence, a faint echoing whisper that seemed to drift through the trees. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then, there it was again, a whisper, distant yet near, as though it was calling to me. I stopped, heart racing. My friends turned to look at me, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Hear what?" one of them replied, their tone dismissive. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "Never mind. Let's just keep going." We pressed on, but the whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't coming from any one direction. They seemed to drift around us as if carried by the very trees themselves. The shadows deepened, casting the woods in an eerie glow. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, pale and gaunt, its features obscured by the fading light. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a trick. But this figure didn't walk like a person. Its movements were unnatural, jerky and slow, as though it didn't belong to the world we knew. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure turned its hollow gaze towards me. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark and empty, like voids of nothingness. "Run," I managed to whisper. But before I could move, my friends stood frozen, transfixed by the figure. I screamed at them to move, but they didn't respond. They were still, staring at the figure like they couldn't look away. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, and I could feel something shift in the air around me. The figure stepped closer, its movements like something out of a nightmare. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest, but my feet wouldn't move, as if the ground itself was holding me in place. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were faces. Hundreds, thousands of hollow, empty faces staring back at me from the darkness. Their mouths were open, whispering, calling out in that haunting, otherworldly language. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its presence pressing against my skin, colder than anything I had ever known. Its breath was a chill, a void of nothingness that seemed to consume everything around me. I could hear my friends murmuring, lost in the whispers of the forest, their eyes wide but unseeing. I was alone now, standing amidst the forest that had become a sea of emptiness, the faces of the trees watching me, waiting. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispers filled my ears, louder and louder, until they became all I could hear. And then there was silence. I was on a road trip, solo, something I'd always wanted to do. Just me, my car, and the open road stretching ahead. I decided to take a scenic route, away from the highways, weaving through small, forgotten towns. The goal was simple: get lost in the quiet and enjoy the freedom of being alone. By the time the sun started to set, I was deep in unfamiliar territory. The winding road was flanked by endless fields of tall grass that seemed to stretch forever. There was nothing around, just miles of isolation and silence. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool air fill the car, the only sounds being the soft hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. As the light faded, I found myself searching for a place to stop for the night. There was no sign of a town or motel for miles, just endless fields and a single, overgrown dirt path leading off to the side of the road. It wasn't much of a choice, but I decided to follow the path, hoping to find a clearing to park and rest. The path led me to a small, abandoned barn surrounded by broken-down fences. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter. The place felt like it hadn't been touched in years, with weeds growing thick through the cracks in the wood. I parked near the entrance, killed the engine, and sat in the silence, the only sound being the wind rustling through the trees. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought maybe it was just an animal, but the feeling of being watched was too distinct. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation didn't fade. I decided to explore the barn, curious about what might be inside. The door creaked open, revealing a musty, dark interior. I stepped cautiously, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered. What was once used to store hay and farm tools had become a hollow shell of rotting wood and forgotten belongings. I moved further into the barn, shining my flashlight around the dusty space. Old furniture covered in layers of grime, rusted tools scattered on the floor. There was nothing of interest, just reminders of what the place once was. I felt my unease growing, but my curiosity kept me going. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light. My breath hitched as I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there in the shadows, watching. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to step closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. But there it was. A human-shaped silhouette standing still as if trapped in the dark. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I took another step, and then another, my legs feeling heavy. With each movement, the figure seemed to draw closer, though it didn't advance itself. It was like we were inching toward each other slowly, relentlessly. When I was just a few feet away, I saw it. The face. Or what I thought was a face. Hollow, sunken eyes stared back at me, void of any life or expression. The features were distorted, almost alien. I couldn't tear my gaze away. The barn creaked again, and then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. I stumbled backward, tripping over some debris and falling to the ground. My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet, trying to escape, but the figure moved faster than I could comprehend. I sprinted toward the exit, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could hear the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps behind me, growing louder, closer. My legs felt like they were on fire as I burst through the barn door, gasping for air. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. I didn't look back, didn't stop. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, the figure far behind, lost in the darkness. I still don't know what I saw that night. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't supposed to be there. But I do know this: I'll never take another solo road trip into the unknown. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. It was a cool, quiet evening, and I had decided to take a walk through the old, deserted forest near my apartment. The trees there have always been tall and ominous, their branches tangled like they were reaching out toward something beyond. I had always felt a strange sense of peace walking through the woods, but that evening was different. It was getting late, and the sky had grown dark, casting everything in a heavy, oppressive silence. I walked further than I usually did, deeper into the forest, the sound of my boots crunching against the fallen leaves the only noise accompanying me. Then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper, like someone calling my name. I stopped, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. My breath hitched, and I told myself it was just the wind. Still, I felt uneasy. The whisper repeated, growing louder, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. I turned around, heart thudding in my chest. The forest behind me stretched out, dark and still, but there was something off about it. The trees seemed to loom closer, their shadows twisting and shifting in ways they shouldn't have. I hurried back, my legs trembling, but the whisper followed me, always just out of reach. When I got home, I didn't mention it to anyone. I thought maybe I had imagined it, some trick of the mind after spending too much time in the quiet. A week passed and I forgot about the whispers, until the second night. This time, I wasn't walking through the forest. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it again. Fainter at first, but growing louder. The whispering came from the corner of my room. It was almost like a voice now, but distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep within my mind. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispering didn't stop. It was closer now, right by my ear. "Come with me," it said, and the words sent shivers down my spine. I stayed frozen, my eyes wide open, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whispering didn't fade away. Instead, it seemed to grow louder, more urgent. "You belong with us," it murmured. I covered my ears, but the sound was still there, filling my head. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The next morning, I woke up exhausted, as though I hadn't slept at all. My head throbbed, and I felt a strange emptiness that wouldn't go away. Still, I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? That I had heard voices? No one would believe me. Days passed, and everything felt different. The whispering never stopped, though I tried to ignore it. It was always there, when I was alone, when I was in public. It followed me like a shadow, growing louder, more distinct. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront it. I went back to the forest, driven by a need to understand what was happening. As I walked deeper into the trees, the whispering grew louder until it was almost a scream. Then, in the dead silence of the woods, I saw them. Shapes, dark figures, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. They didn't move, didn't speak. They were shadows, but somehow, they felt real. The whispering became clearer. "You hear us now," one said. Its voice wasn't human. It was more like a collective, a chorus of countless voices. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't look away. The figures stretched toward me, their features twisted and distorted as though they had no faces, no identity, just voids of endless blackness. "I don't belong here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figures tilted their heads, a soft, eerie sound echoing through the forest. "But you do." I turned to run, but the figures followed as though they were part of the very shadows themselves. The whispering filled my ears, growing louder until I could hear nothing else. I could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating. I woke up the next morning, lying on the ground, covered in dirt and leaves. The forest was silent again, as though nothing had happened. I was alive, but something had changed. Something inside me had shifted. The whispers have never stopped. They still come to me in the quiet, always closer, always more persistent. And now, I know they'll never let me go. It was supposed to be a quiet trip to the lake. Just a few friends and I, escaping the city for the weekend. The plan was simple: set up camp by the water, fish, and relax under the stars. No cell service, no distractions, just nature. I had been looking forward to it, needing the break from the noise of everyday life. We drove deep into the forest, following the narrow, winding path that led to our campsite. The trees stretched endlessly on either side of us, their thick canopies blocking out the sun. It was peaceful, serene. We found a spot right by the edge of the lake, unpacked and set up our tents. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, we built a fire, roasting marshmallows and enjoying the quiet. Night fell quickly, the lake reflecting the faint glow of the crescent moon. We sat around the fire, telling stories and laughing. It was as perfect as I had imagined. But then the noises started. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, a soft, echoing hum, as if the forest itself was breathing. I mentioned it to my friends, but they waved it off, saying it was probably just the wind through the trees. I wasn't so sure. The sound didn't seem natural, and the longer we listened, the more it felt like it was growing closer. Eventually, we all fell silent. The hum had turned into something more distinct, a series of low, guttural whispers. I strained to hear what they were saying, but they were too faint, too distorted. It felt as though they were coming from the trees, surrounding us, but there was no one there. One of my friends, Mark, stood up abruptly and walked toward the edge of the campsite. "It's nothing," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Just the forest playing tricks." But I could see the tension in his shoulders. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they were louder now, more distinct. And then there was a sound that made my blood run cold, a faint scratching, not from the trees or the ground, but from inside the forest itself. It was like something was clawing its way closer, scraping against the bark. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He was frozen, staring at the trees like he'd seen a ghost. And then it happened. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was thin and gaunt, almost skeletal, but its face was obscured by darkness. No features, no eyes, just emptiness. It moved toward us, its steps slow and deliberate, as if it didn't belong in this world. The whispers had become screams now, piercing and agonized. I could feel my heart racing, my body frozen in place. My friends were shouting, but the sound of their voices barely registered. The figure was getting closer, the scratching louder, almost as if it were dragging itself through the trees. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there, maybe a few feet away, completely still. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The whispers had stopped too, replaced by an unbearable silence that felt like it was suffocating us. The air grew colder, heavy, almost suffocating. I could see my breath in the night. Then, from behind us, another sound, the faintest rustle of footsteps. Not from the figure, but from the trees. Something was circling us, moving through the shadows. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him toward the fire. My friends followed, and we stumbled over each other, rushing back to our tents. The whispers were now screams, the rustling footsteps growing louder, echoing through the trees. We didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the trees, every whisper in the dark sent shivers down our spines. Whatever had come for us wasn't leaving. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. It was alive. In the morning, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. The whispers, the figure, the scratching, all of it had vanished by sunrise. But the fear hadn't. To this day, I wonder what we encountered that night. Some part of me still expects to hear those whispers, see that figure wherever I go. And deep down, I know we weren't alone out there. It started with a simple trip. Me and a few friends decided to rent a small lake house nestled deep in the woods. We were looking for a peaceful weekend away from the noise of city life. The house was old, wooden, surrounded by towering pines and the quiet hum of nature. We thought it would be perfect. Serene, isolated, and far from any distractions. The first night was calm. We unpacked, had a few drinks, and sat by the fire. The lake, reflecting the full moon, seemed endless and still. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could almost feel the tension from the city melt away. It felt too quiet, though, unnervingly so. But we brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just the stillness of the woods at night. It was around midnight when I woke. I'd drifted off in one of the old wooden chairs by the window. Something stirred in my dream. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in darkness. That's when I heard it. Soft tapping. I assumed it was rain, but the sky was clear. The sound came again. Light, but deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I turned my head toward the window, listening, expecting to see raindrops. But there was nothing there. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for whatever could be making the noise. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Not a shadow, not a figure. It was a shape, indistinct, something that seemed out of place. I froze. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark outline of the woods outside. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their tops swaying in the wind. Whatever was there wasn't a part of the forest. It felt like it didn't belong. I got up slowly, every step creaking on the old wooden floor. The tapping continued, but now it wasn't just at the window. It was all around the house, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. I peered out again, my eyes straining into the night. There, in the distance, I saw it, just for a second. A figure, not human, not quite. It was tall, thin, and it moved strangely, almost like a distorted reflection of something. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the wall. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining things? But the fear was too real. Something wasn't right. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my voice wouldn't work. The air felt colder, like something had seeped into the house. Then I heard it, the voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like it was right next to me. Come outside." It wasn't coming from anywhere in the house. It was outside. The chill in my bones deepened. I felt like I was frozen, rooted to the floor. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was listen. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. The figure I had seen before was now closer, just beyond the porch. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like stone. The whisper came again, sharper this time. "Let me in." I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure took a step closer. It was unnatural, wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too thin, and its limbs moved like they weren't quite attached to its body. Panic surged through me. I forced myself to turn and sprint toward my friend's rooms. The taps on the window started again, louder, as if they were chasing me. I could feel something behind me, something that wanted to get in. I burst into their room, screaming, and dragged them from their beds. They were groggy at first, but the fear in my voice made them realize something wasn't right. We rushed out the back door, not daring to look back. The figure never followed us. We left the cabin behind, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods where we could no longer see the house. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in a diner miles from where we started, that I finally spoke. "I think we were followed," I said, my voice trembling. "I think something was waiting for us. None of us wanted to go back. None of us ever did." I had always enjoyed hiking alone. The quiet solitude of nature was something I craved, especially after long, stressful weeks. One summer afternoon, I decided to head to a remote trail I'd been eyeing for months. It wasn't marked on most maps, secluded deep in the forest. The trailhead was a dirt path hidden off a narrow road, barely visible to anyone passing by. The hike started as usual. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I reveled in the stillness, lost in the rhythm of my footsteps and the sound of birds overhead. For hours, I trekked through the dense woods, following the winding trail deeper into the forest. The trail eventually began to narrow, the trees pressing in around me. It wasn't long before I realized I'd lost my bearings. I pulled out my map and compass, but neither gave me any clue as to which direction I should go. I sat down on a large rock, trying to collect my thoughts, but the sense of isolation began to creep in. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I wasn't truly lost, just turned around. But as the hours passed and the sunlight dimmed, I started feeling something was wrong. The forest felt heavier. The usual sounds of birds had fallen silent, replaced by an eerie quiet. It was as though the woods themselves had become aware of my presence. I pressed on, my pace quickening, though fear began to seep into my bones. I needed to get out of there. The trail eventually split into two. I didn't know which way to go, so I flipped a coin. Heads. I took the right path. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to loom, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers. The sun had set, leaving the forest in near total darkness. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Shadows danced in the light, appearing as figures just beyond my sight. Suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the sound of my own boots against the ground, but something lighter, quicker. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The footsteps continued, approaching rapidly, echoing unnaturally close. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No response, just the sound of rustling leaves. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, shining it in every direction. The forest felt alive now, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. I took off running, but the footsteps followed, always just behind me. I could hear them breathing, ragged and shallow, as though the thing was right on my heels. I didn't dare look back, but I knew whatever it wasn't human. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the trees bending and creaking with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran until my legs couldn't carry me anymore. Exhausted, I collapsed against a tree, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell deathly quiet again. I could feel something watching me, something I couldn't see, yet I knew it was there, standing just beyond my sight. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the trees. The world around me seemed to blur, and then, in the dim light, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it wasn't human. Its presence radiated something cold, something inhuman. Tears streamed down my face as I turned and ran. The woods stretched endlessly, the path disappearing beneath my feet. I could hear it again, the sound of footsteps, lighter now but unmistakably close. And then, through the haze, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of my flashlight's beam, I glimpsed something hanging from a tree, faint and twisted in the darkness. A figure, a face. It wasn't human, not anymore, just a hollow, warped shape that hung from the tree, swaying gently in the wind. I screamed and ran faster, but I knew it was always right behind me. I didn't stop, couldn't stop, until I burst out of the forest and stumbled into the light of day, gasping for air. I made it out, but even now, I can still feel it, watching, waiting, in the dark, just beyond the edge of sight. It started as an ordinary day at home. I lived alone in a small apartment in the city. Nothing special ever happened, and I liked it that way. But one evening, everything changed. The air was crisp, and I decided to open my window to let in some fresh air. The sounds of the city drifted up, cars honking, distant voices, the hum of traffic. But that evening, it felt different. The usual background noise was quieter, as if the city had fallen into some strange kind of hush. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe everyone else was just quieter tonight. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, flipping through a book. But my focus was slipping. I felt like something was watching me. I couldn't shake the sensation, so I glanced toward the window. The street below was eerily quiet. No cars passed, no people walked by. It was like the world had suddenly gone still. I decided to step onto my balcony, which overlooked the narrow alley between my building and the next. The air felt colder, more oppressive. I leaned against the railing, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger. I swear, the alley had never looked this dark before. The street lamps that usually lit the way barely cast any glow tonight. Everything was in shadows. That's when I noticed it. Movement. At first, I thought it was a stray cat, but the figure that emerged from the darkness didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in ways that defied logic. It glided more than walked, its movements fluid but disjointed. I couldn't see its face, but there was something about the way it moved. So wrong, so unnatural, that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The figure seemed to float closer to my building, heading toward the alley where I stood. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I was too scared to look back outside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the door, afraid to even breathe too loudly. The next day, I didn't see anything unusual, but the fear lingered. I went about my routine, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept the lights on in every room, my eyes darting between the windows and the dark spaces beyond. Around midnight, I heard a soft knocking at the door. My heart stopped. I froze, my breath hitching. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side was counting each tap. I grabbed my phone and backed away, heart racing. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. There was no response, just that relentless knocking. I stood there, unable to move, listening to the sound echo through my apartment. Then came a louder knock followed by the faintest whisper, barely audible, "Let me in." I bolted the door and hid under my bed. I didn't come out until morning, my mind in a fog of fear and disbelief. To this day, I never found an explanation for what I saw or heard. But I know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something human. It was supposed to be a quiet evening out, just me and a few friends. We decided to explore an old abandoned theater that had been shut down for decades. The place was a relic, decaying with its crumbling facade and faded marquee. The theater had always been known for its eerie history, rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of something lurking in the shadows. We weren't expecting much beyond a few creepy sights and maybe some unsettling stories to tell afterward. It wasn't far from town, but far enough that no one really ventured there anymore. The building was dark, with broken windows and faded paint. The sign above the entrance flickered intermittently, creating fleeting glimpses of the name Riverview Theater. We stepped inside, the smell of decay hitting us immediately. Dust hung thick in the air, and the old red velvet seats were tattered and stained. The theater was massive, with the grand stage still intact, though the paint was peeling, revealing layers of once vibrant murals beneath. As we wandered deeper into the building, there was a strange silence. The creaks of the old floorboards echoed around us, amplifying every step we took. The air felt cold, unnatural. I shivered and glanced around, wondering if we'd come too far into a place that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. That's when things started getting strange. We found ourselves in what remained of the lobby. The front doors had long been boarded up, but there was a door behind the counter, leading to the projection room. My friends and I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. I led the way, opening the door slowly. Inside was a long hallway lit by dim, flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with faded, yellowing posters of long-forgotten movies. As we moved down the hall, the floor creaked beneath our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The projection room at the end of the hall was locked. The old rusted door refused to budge no matter how much we pushed. I pulled out my phone to get a better look, and that's when I saw the graffiti etched into the wall. "We're watching you." My blood ran cold, and I realized that whoever wrote that wasn't kidding. I turned around, and that's when I noticed something. A figure, just a faint silhouette, standing at the back of the theater. It was obscured by the shadows, but its presence sent a wave of fear crashing over me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the figure. The light danced across the shadows, revealing nothing. The figure had vanished. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. We decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as we made our way back to the lobby, the door behind us slammed shut, cutting us off from the exit. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of our breathing echoed in the empty theater, growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above. The creaking of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. My flashlight caught a glimpse of movement on the balcony. I froze, shining the beam up toward the second level. A figure stood there, staring down at us. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure had no face, just an empty void where the eyes should have been. Its silhouette seemed to blur, shifting and stretching in a way that was unnatural. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the main entrance, tripping over ourselves in our haste. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The door, however, was still sealed shut. In desperation, I turned back to the balcony, expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I saw something far worse. It wasn't a figure at all. It was a screen, glowing faintly. But the screen wasn't showing any movie. It was showing us. There we were, standing at the front of the theater, faces frozen in horror. But something was wrong. Our reflections weren't acting like we were. The shadows, the empty eyes, they weren't reflections at all. They were watching us, mimicking us. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing when the screen went dark. The theater was plunged into total darkness, except for the faint glow of my phone. My friends and I managed to break free from the building somehow, sprinting into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town. The old theater remained behind us, a broken, silent shell under the pale moonlight. We never spoke of what we saw that night, and we never went back. I was 13 when it happened, during a summer trip to my grandparents' old farmhouse. It wasn't just any trip. It was supposed to be a simple visit, full of farmland sunsets and lazy afternoons. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The farmhouse itself was isolated, sitting at the edge of an overgrown field, far from any neighboring houses. My parents assured me it was just an old family home, quiet and peaceful. But from the moment I walked in, a strange sense of unease took hold. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The old wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of each step, and the creaking of the house seemed louder in the silence than it should have been. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the house, it was from outside. At first, I dismissed it as some small animal, maybe a bird or a raccoon, but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate as the hours passed. In the morning, I asked my grandmother about the noise. She shrugged, a little smile playing on her lips. Just the old trees. The wind does strange things out here. But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it either. The days passed, but the tapping never stopped. It wasn't just random anymore. It was constant. I began to hear it even when I was awake, echoing through the empty halls of the farmhouse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed by unseen eyes. One afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding fields. They stretched out for miles, untouched by modern life, just the way they had been for decades. The air was thick with the scent of hay and soil. The trees creaked gently as the wind picked up, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I wandered far from the farmhouse until I could no longer see the building. That's when I saw it. A figure. Not far from where I stood, barely visible beneath the branches of a gnarled oak tree. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, too tall, its form distorted as if it didn't belong in the world. I couldn't make out its face, only dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its head, lifeless and empty. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still, unmoving, as though waiting for me. Slowly, I raised my hand, and with a trembling finger, I pointed. The figure didn't react. It didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, silent and endless. The tapping continued. Only now it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It seemed to come from within me, a dull rhythm that echoed in my ears. I felt like I was being pulled toward the figure, drawn in by something I couldn't understand. I don't know how much time passed before I finally turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had, back toward the farmhouse. The figure never followed. It simply watched, unmoving, as I fled. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the tapping. It was quieter now, but still there, persistent and unrelenting. I realized that whatever I had seen wasn't something I could run from. It had become a part of me. We left the farmhouse the next day, but the tapping never stopped. I can still hear it sometimes, especially in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It's there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. It was late summer, and I decided to take a day off to explore the old abandoned amusement park. No one had been there in years, and the place had become a local legend. I remember hearing whispers about it being haunted, but I always dismissed those tales as just folklore. The park sat just a few miles from town, hidden between the trees, its entrance overgrown with weeds and ivy. When I arrived, the sight of rusting roller coasters and decayed ticket booths sent a chill through me. The once vibrant colors of the rides had faded to dull grays and greens. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making your own breathing feel too loud. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. I began exploring, walking through the empty park, my footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. There was a sense of emptiness so profound, it felt as if the park itself was holding its breath. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the park had been waiting for someone like me to come back. The longer I wandered, the more unsettling it became. The rides loomed above, their rusted tracks creaking softly in the wind. I passed the old Ferris wheel, its once bright lights now dull and flickering weakly. The carousel had lost its once lively tunes, now reduced to the faintest of echoes. I decided to check out the haunted house ride, the most infamous attraction. The faded sign above the entrance read, "Dark Carnival." I hesitated, standing at the entrance, my heart thudding in my chest. The thought of venturing inside made my stomach churn, but curiosity won out. I stepped inside. The first few steps felt normal enough, but as I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. The air grew colder, and the silence became more oppressive. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, shifting in ways they shouldn't. I could hear distant whispers, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. At one point, I came to a part of the ride where mirrors used to reflect the illusion of endless hallways. But, instead of reflections, I saw something far more disturbing. Shadows that stretched and writhed as if they were alive. My breath hitched, and I quickly turned away, my pulse racing. The further I explored, the more the whispers became distinct. They weren't voices, but something far more sinister. Low, echoing murmurs that seemed to come from inside my own head. I kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The walls around me seemed to pulse faintly, as if the place itself was alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled forward and fell, landing hard. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw something on the floor. A black handprint, impossibly large, as if made by something inhuman. My stomach twisted as I realized the prints led deeper into the maze of the haunted house. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. The shadows felt closer now, watching, waiting. I pressed on, hearing the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It was as if whatever was there was feeding off my fear. Finally, I emerged from the dark maze and found myself back in the open air, beneath the pale light of the moon. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the feeling of being followed didn't fade. I glanced back toward the entrance of the haunted house. The whispers were now louder, as if they were surrounding me. Then I saw it, a figure standing motionless by the entrance, its face obscured by shadows. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed faintly, a faint, otherworldly light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the exit, every step feeling like it might be my last. The figure didn't follow, but I could still hear the whispers in my ears, clearer than ever. The next morning, I drove past the park on my way home. The place seemed just as desolate as before, but something felt different. The whispers still echoed in my head, and I swear I could hear them even now, as if whatever I encountered had found a way into my mind, and I could never escape it. It was an ordinary day, or so I thought. My family had decided to spend the weekend at a nearby lake, a place we used to visit years ago when I was a child. I remember the crisp air, the sound of the water gently lapping at the shore, and the quiet seclusion. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun sinking low in the sky. My parents unpacked the car while my siblings and I ran toward the water. The familiar smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, and for a while everything felt calm and peaceful. We fished off the dock, laughed, and swam in the cool, clear water. As the sun began to set, we decided to set up camp near the lake. My dad had brought a tent, and we found a spot far from the main area surrounded by thick trees. The fire crackled softly, and we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. It was exactly what we needed, a break from the noise and stress. Around midnight, my parents decided it was time to turn in. I stayed by the fire, wanting to soak in the stillness of the night for just a little longer. The firelight flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake and shivering. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, leaving only faint traces of warmth. The forest around me was silent, but there was something off. I sat up, stretching my arms. The air felt colder than before, and there was a strange stillness, like the whole world had stopped breathing. I glanced at the tree line, expecting to see the familiar shape of the tent, but it was gone. In its place was only darkness. At first, I thought maybe my family had gone for a walk or stepped away from the camp, but something didn't feel right. I called out their names, my voice swallowed by the stillness. No response. I stood up, my heart hammering. The night was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the stars to guide me. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the oppressive silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I tried to stay calm, telling myself they were just nearby, maybe searching for firewood or exploring. I made my way toward the tree line, stepping cautiously over the uneven ground. The woods seemed endless, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. The silence grew louder with every step I took. It wasn't until I stumbled across something that I stopped cold, a trail of small bare footprints in the dirt. They were tiny, almost childlike, but there were no children in our group. I followed them for a few steps before the unease turned to terror. The footprints led away from our camp toward the deeper parts of the forest. "Mom? Dad? Sam? Emma?" I called again, my voice breaking. My knees felt weak as I followed the trail, the strange prints leading me further into the trees. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the branches overhead seemed like it was drawing closer. Finally, I stumbled upon something, a faint light, not from the stars or the moon, but from a source deeper in the woods. It flickered like a distant candle. My stomach sank as I moved closer, my pulse quickening. What I found made my skin crawl. A clearing opened up ahead, and there, in the middle of it, was a figure standing perfectly still. It was cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like something ancient and otherworldly. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head as if examining me. A sharp, dry crack echoed through the forest as it took a slow step forward. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, as I watched in silent horror. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The light flickered once more and vanished into the darkness. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran. The forest seemed endless, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to the camp, back to some sense of safety. I didn't stop until I could see the faint glow of the remaining embers from the fire. When I got there, I found my family. They were unharmed, asleep in the tent as if nothing had happened. They had no memory of waking up in the middle of the night, no memory of wandering into the woods, as if time had folded and they hadn't been touched by whatever had stalked me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, what followed me through those woods. All I know is that I haven't returned to that place. The memories still haunt me, and every time I hear the sound of silence, I'm reminded of that night, when something far beyond explanation walked in the shadows. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore an old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The park had been closed for decades, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by everyone. The faded, crumbling entrance sign seemed to scream out to us, promising something eerie and unknown. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. We wandered down the cracked paths, past the rusting remnants of broken rides. The Ferris wheel stood towering, skeletal, and empty. Everything felt frozen in time, silent, lifeless, and oddly oppressive. No laughter or music from forgotten years echoed through the park, only the distant creak of old metal and the occasional rustling of leaves. We kept moving deeper into the park, unsure of what we were hoping to find. It wasn't the typical thrill of the unknown. It felt darker. As we approached the old carousel, I noticed something odd. The wooden horses weren't just decaying. They seemed to have faces carved into them. Hollow eyes, twisted grins. I instinctively stepped back, my pulse quickening. "What the hell is this?" someone whispered. We tried to laugh it off, but the unease was settling in too deeply. There were too many strange details, small things we couldn't ignore. The once bright colors of the rides had faded into drab, muted hues, and the air felt dense, as though it was pressing in on us. At one point, we came across an old photo booth. It was the only thing still relatively intact. The curtain was tattered, flapping in the wind, and the once vivid pictures printed from the machine were scattered across the floor. I bent down to pick one up, an image of a family smiling, frozen in time. But something wasn't right. The smiles were crooked, their eyes staring past the camera as if they were looking at something we couldn't see. Something about that photo sent a chill down my spine. I looked up, expecting to see my friends, but they had wandered off, further into the park. I hesitated for a moment before following them, clutching the photograph tightly. The deeper we went, the more things began to feel off. The sounds we had heard earlier, the creaking, the wind, began to shift into something unnatural. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves anymore, it was the faint, distant sound of laughter, but it wasn't coming from us. The laughter seemed to come from the depths of the park, distorted and hollow, echoing in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It felt like it was all around us, but we couldn't see a source. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us dared to speak. We eventually found ourselves near the old roller coaster, once grand, now rotted and skeletal. The metal rails were twisted, dangling in midair like broken teeth. Below it, there was an old wooden bench covered in mold. A single flicker of something caught my eye, a small faded envelope resting on the bench. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and picked it up. It was sealed shut, but the paper was worn and fragile. I opened it carefully, revealing a single faded photograph inside. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same photo booth picture I had found earlier, a family frozen in time, but this one was different. The figures were closer, and their eyes weren't lifeless anymore. They were watching me, staring directly at me. Through the picture, as if they knew I had it, I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I glanced up, heart racing, and realized the laughter had stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Suddenly, my friends were screaming from deeper within the park. "Run!" someone shouted. "Get out of here!" I didn't think twice. I shoved the photo back into the envelope and bolted, my legs pumping as the distant cries of my friends echoed in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the entrance of the park. The moment I stepped onto the pavement, the air seemed lighter, but my heart was still pounding. I didn't dare look back. That night, back home, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The photo was still clutched tightly in my hand, the faces of the family still watching. I haven't been able to bring myself to throw it away. Whatever was out there in that park, whatever was left behind, it's still following me. I can feel it. And every night, I wonder if it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. I've always loved hiking and spending time in nature. It was one of those things that grounded me, being out in the woods, away from the noise of the world. A few weeks ago, my friends and I decided to explore a trail we hadn't been on before. It wasn't too far from town, but far enough that we figured we'd have it to ourselves. The day was perfect. Clear skies, the sun warming our backs as we hiked deeper into the woods. We made our way to a secluded clearing, nestled between towering trees. It was peaceful. Birds chirped, and the wind whispered through the leaves, carrying the scent of pine. We set up camp near a stream, took off our backpacks, and stretched out, content to take in the beauty of the forest. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees, we gathered around the fire we'd built. The crackling sound of the flames was soothing, and we all felt at ease, joking and sharing stories. I didn't realize how dark it had become until one of my friends pointed up at the sky. "It's almost pitch black," she said, squinting upward. We all looked at each other, the laughter fading into a heavy silence. None of us had expected how fast the night would fall. The forest seemed to absorb the fading light, leaving us in complete darkness, save for the fire. Then, something shifted. I wasn't sure if it was the stillness of the forest or the creeping sensation in the pit of my stomach, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone. I didn't want to alarm my friends, so I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind rustling the leaves or my imagination playing tricks. But then I heard it. A faint, unnatural noise coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't a creature or an animal. It was something wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the source of the noise. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing there, just more blackness. My friends noticed my unease and asked if I was okay. I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy, but my voice came out shaky as I answered. "There's something out there." One of my friends scoffed. "It's probably just a deer or something." I wanted to believe that, but it didn't feel like an animal. The noise grew louder, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was distant at first, then closer. Each tap echoed through the trees, growing louder and more persistent. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice trembling. "Back where?" one of my friends asked. "The trail's too far. We'd be walking in the dark." But something about the forest felt off, like the trees themselves were watching us. The tapping continued, closer now, like something was moving through the underbrush. Then, the silence shattered. A figure emerged from the trees, moving in a way that wasn't human. Its form was elongated, almost unnatural, and it moved without making a sound. I could barely process what I was seeing, my heart racing as I fumbled with my flashlight. The beam hit it, and that's when I saw its face. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow black void where a face should have been. It stood there, unmoving, watching us. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The thing didn't approach us, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching. One of my friends whispered, "What is that?" "I have no idea," I managed to choke out. We sat frozen, staring at the figure until the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the direction of the figure. It was coming from behind us, from the clearing where we had our camp. We spun around, shining our flashlights. There was nothing there, just the fire, flickering dimly. But the tapping grew louder, now on both sides of us. Panic set in. We grabbed our things and ran, not looking back, not stopping, until we reached the trail. The figure never followed us, but the sounds didn't stop. They still echo in my mind. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I keep wondering, what was that thing? And why didn't it come after us? It was a quiet night at the old cinema. I was the only one working, the projectionist. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The theater itself was a relic, built decades ago with worn-out seats and a projector that creaked like an old ship. The movies were rarely popular anymore, but the few people who still came were loyal, Regulars who didn't seem to mind the dust and the dim lighting. I liked the quiet, the solitude. But tonight, something felt off. The last showing had ended hours ago, and now I was in the projection room, staring at the faint glow of the reel spinning. I was about to shut down the projector when I heard it, the faintest noise. A whisper, almost too soft to hear, coming from the hall below. I froze, listening. The theater had been empty for hours, or at least I thought it had. The whisper wasn't just in my head, it was real, distinct. It came again, a voice barely above a breath. "Help." I leaned closer to the edge of the projection room, peering down into the darkness. The hall was still. Nothing. My heart raced as I hesitated, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help. Please." It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it wasn't from the films either. It wasn't part of the stories on screen. My breath caught in my throat, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I descended the stairs slowly, every step echoing in the vast, empty space. The whispers continued, now more distinct. "I'm here. Please." I reached the main floor of the theater. The screen flickered faintly, casting long shadows in the dim light. The chairs were empty, just as they had been when the last film ended. Yet, the whispers came from the seats, as if someone, something, was sitting there. I moved cautiously toward the source of the voice, my eyes strained, trying to pierce the darkness. The whispers became clearer, more desperate. I can't get out." I turned my head, scanning the rows of seats, but saw no one. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. They were coming from beneath one of the seats. Trembling, I knelt down and lifted the seat. Beneath it, there was nothing, only the cold, bare floor. But the whispers were louder now, echoing in my ears as if they had no source at all. Panic gripped me. I wanted to run, but something held me in place, rooted to the spot. The whispers didn't stop. "Help. Please." Then, suddenly, there was silence, complete and oppressive. My heart was hammering, and I clutched my chest, wondering if I'd imagined it all. That's when I saw it. A faint outline of a figure on the far side of the theater, barely illuminated by the screen. It was a shape, taller than a person, its form blending with the shadows. No face, just an empty void where eyes should be. Before I could react, the figure moved closer, drifting silently across the room. It didn't walk. It glided, like smoke being pulled through the air. My breath caught again, and I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against something cold. I turned, only to find an empty row of seats behind me. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The theater was still empty. The screen blinked, casting distorted reflections of the room onto itself, but the whispers had stopped. I didn't stay long after that. I locked up and left, never looking back. I never heard those whispers again. I had always been fascinated by the old house at the end of the street. It was a place I passed every day on my way home from school, its faded, peeling paint and overgrown yards standing out from the otherwise ordinary suburban neighborhood. No one lived there, or at least no one who was ever seen. The house seemed to exist in a quiet, unsettling limbo, untouched by time. One day, I found myself walking past it again, the sun sinking low behind the horizon. Curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I found myself at the front gate. The rusted hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the weight of years shifting as the gate groaned in protest. I stepped into the yard, the grass crunching beneath my feet. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless. I had always heard stories about that house, whispers of strange sounds, of lights that flickered in the night, of shadows that moved in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. But I never believed in such things, at least not until that day. I approached the front door, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but it didn't turn. The door was locked. I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment, and stepped back. But then I noticed something. Movement from one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, shifting, just for a moment. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, something my mind conjured up in the dim twilight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Despite my better judgment, I approached the side of the house, creeping closer to a window that was partially cracked open. The boards covering it were old and warped, barely hanging on. I pressed my face to the opening, peering inside. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the outlines of furniture, ancient, covered in dust. A faint glimmer of something metallic caught my eye, resting on a table. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from somewhere inside the house, and I jumped back, heart pounding. My breath quickened as I stepped away from the window, the realization hitting me that I wasn't alone. The silence seemed to stretch, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me. I had to get out, but just as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from inside the house. "Stay." I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. It was hollow, almost robotic, like something long forgotten had spoken from beyond the grave. A shiver ran down my spine. My feet felt frozen to the ground. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Stay." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step back. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt caught in my throat. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the air grow heavier, darker, as though the house itself had become alive, watching me, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my heart racing, my breaths shallow, trying to convince myself it was over. I turned, finally running, sprinting down the street, my mind replaying the voice in my head. I never went back to that house. To this day, I still wonder what was in there, what was waiting. But some things are better left untouched, hidden away, behind doors that should never be opened. I had always loved nature, the quiet peace of being out in the open, surrounded by trees and distant mountains. One summer, my friends and I decided to spend the weekend hiking deep into a remote part of the forest. No cell service, no electricity, just us, the trail, and the wilderness. It sounded perfect, a chance to disconnect and escape the noise of the world. The hike started easy enough. The trail was narrow, winding through tall trees with sunlight filtering through the canopy. We made good time, laughing and sharing stories, taking occasional breaks to catch our breath. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. It wasn't the usual comforting silence of the forest. It was an unnatural stillness, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. We reached a clearing and decided to set up camp. The sky was clear, the stars visible above us. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of crickets. We built a fire, cooked some food, and enjoyed the peace. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, as we lay in our sleeping bags, I heard it. A faint whisper, too quiet to make out, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I stayed still, pretending to be asleep, listening. It wasn't coming from any of my friends. The voices were too distant, too faint, but they seemed to be everywhere at once. I didn't say anything, hoping it was just my imagination. But when I woke the next morning, things had changed. The air felt heavier, colder. My friends noticed it too. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, something we couldn't quite explain. While my friends were packing up, I wandered off to explore. The woods had always been my escape, but today something felt different. I followed a narrow path deeper into the trees, drawn by a sense of curiosity and unease. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted and gnarled, almost like they were watching. That's when I saw it, a figure standing perfectly still among the trees. It wasn't moving, just watching me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was hard to make out at first, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It was a tall, gaunt figure, its face partially obscured by the shadows of the forest. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, as if waiting. Panic set in. I turned to run, but my legs felt frozen, heavy. I couldn't look away. The figure remained unmoving, its presence so unnatural it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. I spun around, expecting one of my friends, but there was no one. The woods were silent again. I didn't wait to find out what was following me. I ran back to camp, heart racing. My friends were there, gathering our things. I didn't want to scare them, so I kept what I had seen to myself. We left the clearing and continued down the trail, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That night, as we made our way back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything in the shadows of the trees. But there was nothing. The forest had returned to its usual stillness. To this day, I don't know what I saw. A trick of the light, my mind playing tricks, or something else entirely. But the figure, the feeling of being watched, those are memories that will stay with me forever. It was the last day of my trip to the mountains. I had spent the past week hiking, exploring remote trails and basking in the beauty of nature. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, at least during the day. On my final evening, I decided to take one last walk down to a secluded pond deep in the forest. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, inky black. The trees stretched high above, casting long shadows that made it feel like the world was shrinking around me. The walk to the pond wasn't long, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the isolation, the stillness pressing against my chest. It felt as though the world had been hushed just for me. I reached the pond, which glimmered under the dim light of the stars reflecting off the water. I sat down on a rock, letting out a long breath. As I stared into the still pond, something shifted in the water's surface. A ripple formed, spreading outward in slow waves. I leaned in closer, my reflection breaking apart with each wave. But then something else appeared, something underneath the surface. At first, it looked like just another reflection, distorted by the ripples. But then I saw it. Two pale, lifeless eyes staring back at me from the depths. I stumbled back from the water, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched those eyes slowly rise from the depths. The figure emerged slowly, its movements awkward, unnatural. It was pale, its skin wrinkled and damp like it had been submerged for years. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. The figure didn't step fully out of the water. It hovered just above the surface, those hollow eyes still locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me, but its gaze never wavered. I ran, heart racing, lungs burning with every step. The forest around me seemed alive, the trees stretching their branches toward the ground like clawed hands. I didn't stop until I was back at my campsite, my chest heaving. The echo of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. The next morning, I returned to the pond one last time, but there was nothing there, just the still water and the empty forest. Whatever I saw, whatever that thing was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, hidden somewhere deep in the shadows of the woods. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right, her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. It was a summer afternoon when we decided to take a spontaneous drive out to the old abandoned amusement park. None of us had ever been before, but we'd heard the stories. Rumors of a park that had been shut down decades ago, overgrown with weeds and vines, its colorful rides rusting and decaying. We weren't looking for anything creepy, just a place to explore and take some pictures. The drive there wasn't long, about an hour through winding country roads. The sun was high and the air was thick with the scent of wildflowers. As we pulled up to the entrance, the first thing we noticed was how eerily quiet it was. The gates were rusted shut, but we squeezed through a gap in the fence and stepped onto the cracked asphalt. The place looked like something straight out of a forgotten dream. "Look at this," someone said, their voice quiet, almost reverent. We stood in awe at the sight before us. The remains of what must have once been a lively and vibrant amusement park. Faded signs still hung overhead, some barely legible. Ferris wheels, their once bright colors now faded and peeling, stood in silence, looming like ancient sentinels. The tracks of a roller coaster were still visible, but most of the cars had rusted into skeletal remains. The silence was oppressive. There wasn't even the chirping of birds, just the distant hum of wind through empty, hollow spaces. We wandered from ride to ride, snapping photos, laughing, and sharing stories about the park's past. It felt like a trip back in time, though none of us truly believed in the urban legends we had heard. It was just a derelict amusement park, nothing more than an old curiosity. But things started to change. As we approached an old haunted house ride, something felt off. The air felt colder, the light dimmer, though the sun was still high above. We tried to brush it off, thinking maybe our imaginations were just running wild. One of us suggested we split up, explore different areas of the park, and regroup later. I reluctantly agreed. I wandered deeper into the park, feeling increasingly uneasy. The further I went, the quieter things became, until I couldn't even hear the others anymore. My footsteps echoed off the cracked pavement. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but every creak, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. That's when I saw it, the figure standing at the edge of the roller coaster tracks. It was hard to tell what it was at first, blending into the shadows. A tall, slender figure, maybe a person, maybe not. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stared back at it, locked in some kind of strange, silent standoff. Time felt frozen, as if the world had come to a standstill. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked into the woods. My fear finally snapped, and I sprinted back toward the main part of the park, calling out for my friends. When I got there, they were already gathered, looking at me with worried expressions. I told them what I'd seen, but they didn't believe me at first. We searched the area, but the figure, or whatever it had been, was gone. We all chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe the stress of the place getting to me. But then, later that night, after we'd left the park and were back in the quiet of our homes, something strange happened. In a flash of clarity, I remembered something I hadn't noticed before. The faded sign near the entrance had a small line of text at the bottom, something I hadn't seen earlier. It read, "Those who enter never leave." I used to visit my grandfather's house every summer when I was a kid. It was an old farmhouse, isolated, sitting at the edge of a quiet valley. My parents used to leave me there for weeks while they traveled, and I never minded. Grandpa was old and grumpy, but he told the best stories about the woods that surrounded us. The house itself wasn't much, a weathered wooden structure with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper. Outside, there were fields of tall grass stretching endlessly, and beyond that, the forest. One evening, as I explored the woods near his house, I noticed something strange. There was an old, abandoned barn deeper into the trees, one I had never seen before. It stood isolated from the rest of the woods, its roof sagging and walls covered in ivy. It was out of place, and curiosity got the better of me. I approached the barn, my steps quiet on the grass. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There was a faint, almost imperceptible noise, like whispers carried by the wind. I stopped, listening. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside the barn, but there was no sign of life around it. I pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the barn was dark, except for slivers of light filtering through the broken roof. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy. It smelled of decay, wood, rot, and something else I couldn't place. I could barely see, but I moved cautiously, my heartbeat quickening. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. A tall, slender shadow that didn't quite belong. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers had grown louder, almost like they were surrounding me now. I strained to see more, but the figure remained in the shadows. Then, slowly, it moved. Not like a human, though. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if whatever this thing was didn't know how to walk properly. It tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in its hollow eyes. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more frantic. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, the barn now filled with that oppressive silence, only broken by those relentless whispers. And then, from the shadows, I heard a voice. "Help me." It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human either, low and raspy, like it hadn't spoken in centuries. My legs felt like lead, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. The whispers became screams, but they were inside my head. I could feel them, clawing at my mind. The figure stepped closer, its limbs bent awkwardly as if they didn't belong to a living thing, and then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I collapsed to the floor, unable to move or think. My heart thundered in my chest, and the barn was silent again. I sat there for what felt like hours, unsure if the fear or the silence was worse. When I finally managed to stand, I left the barn and didn't look back. The rest of the summer passed without further incident. My grandfather never mentioned the barn, and I never brought it up. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I know one thing. It wasn't human, and it wasn't supposed to be there. It was a hot summer evening, and I had decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind a deep, velvety darkness that seemed to stretch forever. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light, casting long shadows down the sidewalks. I lived in an old, quiet, suburban neighborhood that had once been bustling, but now felt hollow and deserted. Most of the houses were dark, their windows blank and lifeless. As I walked, I noticed the silence. No chirping of crickets, no rustling leaves. It was unnaturally still. The only sounds were the faint echoes of my own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Halfway through my walk, I noticed something off about the house 2 doors down from mine. Its porch light was flickering, buzzing faintly, like it couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be on or off. The windows were dark, and there was a strange emptiness to the place, as if the house itself had been abandoned long ago. But the most unsettling part was the shape standing by the front door. A tall, thin figure cloaked in shadow. At first, I thought it was just the edge of a tree or a dark outline of the house. But then I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately. The figure didn't seem human. It wasn't walking like someone lost or wandering. It moved with purpose, as if it were waiting, watching for something. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me wanted to turn and run. I wanted to shout, to call out, but something held me frozen in place. The figure tilted its head, staring in my direction. I could barely make out its outline, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The way it stood so still, yet seemed entirely aware of my presence. Slowly, it began to move towards me, taking long, measured steps. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped, rooted to the spot. The figure was almost close enough to make out its features when suddenly, without warning, it stopped. It stood there, facing me, just a few yards away. The silence stretched so thick I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then, without any discernible reason, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, almost mechanical, like it had been recorded and played back. "You should not be here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I tried to take a step backward, but my body wouldn't move. The figure began to step closer again, and I could feel my panic rising. It tilted its head again, tilting toward me as if it was studying something. Then, almost too quietly to hear, it whispered, "You should have left already." Suddenly, everything snapped back into focus. My legs moved on their own, and I bolted down the street, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't look back, not once, until I was safely back home, slamming the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The figure's words haunted me. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human. And I pray I never see it again. The night it happened, I wasn't even supposed to be there. A few friends and I decided on a spontaneous trip to an abandoned train station. It was old, long forgotten, deep in the woods, miles from civilization. The place had always held a strange allure, a remnant from a past that seemed almost mythical. The tracks were overgrown, the station itself crumbling under years of neglect. We hiked out there with flashlights, excited for the eerie adventure. The walk felt normal at first, just trees, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet, and the sounds of creatures in the woods. It wasn't until we reached the station that the mood shifted. The first thing we noticed was the silence. It wasn't the typical woods silence, the kind where animals go quiet at dusk. This was deeper, as if the forest itself had gone still, like something had pressed pause on the world. Even our own voices felt muted, unnatural. We made our way inside the old building. The walls were stained with mildew, the air thick with the smell of decay. Broken benches and faded posters hung loosely from the walls. Graffiti covered most surfaces, scribbled warnings of danger and decay, but something about it felt different, wrong. We wandered further into the station, and that's when things started to feel off. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light of our flashlights. We heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from inside the building, as if they were the echoes of something long gone. I looked at my friends, and we all shared uneasy glances, not sure if we were imagining it or if something truly was there with us. Then, from down the corridor, we heard it, a faint metallic clinking, like something was dragging along the floor. We froze. The sound came again, closer this time, like it was coming toward us. I signaled to my friends to stay still, but before we could even speak, the light flickered above us. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the station, and the air felt charged, like we were standing in the center of some unexplainable tension. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. The clinking grew louder, echoing off the cracked walls. It wasn't coming from one of us. Something was there. A figure emerged from the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably human-like. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and it appeared more as a shadow than a person. I stepped back, heart pounding. My friends had already begun to whisper frantically, but none of us could make sense of what we were seeing. The figure didn't seem fully alive. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over bones that looked too sharp, like they didn't belong. Its eyes were hollow, black as night, and it moved toward us without any sign of consciousness or intent. That's when we realized it wasn't human. Panic set in, but we didn't run. We couldn't. It was like the creature had already consumed the world around it, leaving only that suffocating silence. We turned to leave, but the door that had been open earlier was now shut. No breeze, no reason for it to have closed. The creature let out another growl, louder now, closer. We could hear its footsteps dragging along the floor as it approached. It didn't seem to care whether we ran or stayed. It didn't care if we lived or died. It wasn't moving with purpose, but with an unrelenting pull towards something. In that moment, it wasn't just fear that consumed me. It was confusion. What was this thing? What was it after? I don't know how much time passed before it stopped. The growling faded, and the dragging noise was gone. We didn't move. We didn't speak. The shadows grew darker, almost as if they were swallowing the faint glow of our flashlights. When we finally gathered the courage to look again, the station was empty. The door had opened. We walked out into the night, our breaths heavy, and we didn't look back. I've never gone back to that train station. I don't know what we encountered that night, and I don't think I want to. But every time I'm alone, there's always that thought. Whatever it was, it's still out there. It was an ordinary Saturday when we decided to explore the old lake. It wasn't just any lake, it was surrounded by dense woods, hidden far from the main road. My friends and I had stumbled upon it years ago while hiking, but never spent much time there. Today, curiosity got the better of us. We packed a picnic and drove out, eager to spend the afternoon away from the usual noise of the city. The day was perfect at first. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and the lake itself was calm and inviting. We set up our blankets near the shore, and for a few hours it felt like the world had stopped. We swam, took photos, and laughed under the canopy of trees. The forest around us seemed alive, buzzing with insects and birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, we began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, like voices carried from the depths of the woods. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They shook their heads, focused on the lake. I stood up, looking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. They weren't words, just faint, distorted murmurs, like something from a dream, calling out from the forest. "We should go back," I said, my heart starting to race. The feeling of unease was creeping in, swallowing any sense of peace we had earlier. "No way," one of my friends laughed. "We've got another hour of daylight, we're fine." I hesitated, wanting to stay but feeling that nagging, primal instinct to get out. Still, we stayed a little longer, hoping the sounds would fade. But they didn't. It was like the forest was alive, its very trees whispering to each other. The murmurs were all around us now, growing louder, almost like they were speaking directly to us. One of my friends, Mark, turned white as he stared at the woods, his eyes wide and searching. "I swear I hear something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not normal." I glanced at the others. None of them seemed to be reacting as strongly, but I could see the tension in their faces. The air had turned colder and the woods were shifting. Silent one moment, then alive with rustling leaves and distant sounds. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, casting the area in shadows. Everything seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. Mark stood up, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." The others agreed, though reluctantly. We quickly packed our things, keeping our eyes on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from them. The whispers grew louder as we walked toward the car, but no one spoke, too caught up in the creeping dread. When we reached the car, I turned back one last time, searching the forest for any sign of life. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It wasn't human, though. It was long and twisted, like a shadow, but with shape. It vanished in an instant, but I knew it had been watching us. My friends didn't see it, and I didn't say a word. I just got in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. We drove away from the lake in silence, leaving the strange murmurs behind us. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the darkness. I've never been back to that lake, and I never plan to. Whatever was out there, it felt alive, watching, waiting. And I know now, some things are better left unexplored. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail, and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I blinked, and there it was again. A figure. At the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking, thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint, dragging footsteps, but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop, but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff. now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind where the city seems to slow down, and all I could hear was the distant hum of cars passing by. The apartment building where I lived was old, with creaky floorboards and thin walls. I lived on the 4th floor, in a corner unit with windows that looked out over a row of old, weathered rooftops. I was sitting on the couch, engrossed in a book, when I heard the soft, repetitive tapping at my window. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, but when I glanced up, I realized there was no wind. It was perfectly still outside. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I hesitated, my stomach twisting in knots. The apartment felt too quiet now, too still. I didn't want to move, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood slowly, tiptoeing toward the window. I pressed my face to the glass. Below me, in the alley between buildings, there was a figure. It stood completely still, staring up at my window. At first, I couldn't make out much. It was dark, and my view wasn't clear. But then, the figure moved closer, shuffling forward in a slow, unnatural way. Its movements were mechanical, jerky, as if it wasn't fully human. Panic set in as I realized its face was partially obscured, but I could still see the eyes. Empty, hollow, and void of life. They seemed to stare right through me, past the glass. I took a step back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping stopped. Silence followed except for my own breathing. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been. Nothing moved, no sounds from outside. I didn't dare turn away from the window. Minutes passed, but the figure didn't move again. I was about to force myself to look away when, suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire room went dark for a brief second, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. It was late October, the leaves crunching beneath my feet as I made my way down the quiet country road. I had decided to take a long walk that evening, needing some fresh air away from the dull hum of city life. The sun was setting, casting long dark shadows over the rolling hills, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of trees in the breeze. I'd grown up in this area, a small town surrounded by farmland and open spaces. The woods were always eerie at night, but tonight felt different. The air was colder, heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I walked, I noticed how distant the usual sounds of animals had become. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Even the wind had quieted. I reached the edge of the woods, the trees towering like silent sentinels on either side of the road. The sun had nearly set now, leaving only a dim orange glow on the horizon. It was too early to be this dark. That's when I saw it, standing between two trees, perfectly still, a figure watching me from the shadows. It was human-shaped, but there was something off about it. Its posture was wrong, unnatural. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure if I should move or run. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was like something out of a nightmare, just a shadow in the fading light. My legs felt frozen as I tried to look away, but something held my gaze. Who's there? My voice trembled as I forced the words out. The silence stretched on, and then nothing. No response. No sound of breathing. No movement. I wanted to run. I turned back toward the road, but as I did, I saw another figure appear in the distance, emerging from the opposite side of the woods. This one was even closer than I thought possible. It didn't walk. It glided, silently, effortlessly. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't human. The shape was wrong, distorted, like something had stretched it out of proportion. My mind raced as I backed away, hands trembling, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was nearly at the edge of the road. The two figures, now several feet apart, stood motionless, their black, empty eyes staring toward me. I realized, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that I hadn't heard any footsteps, just silence. And yet they were there, both of them, in the middle of nowhere, watching me. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could, the figures vanishing into the darkness behind me. I never looked back. To this day, I don't know what they were, but I know they weren't human. I've always loved the forest. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the fresh air, and the quiet that draws me in. So, when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, I didn't hesitate. It sounded perfect, peaceful, serene, just what we needed to escape from the chaos of city life. We packed up our gear, grabbed some supplies, and hiked several miles into the heart of the forest. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves, but the scenery was breathtaking. As we set up camp, I remember how quiet everything felt. No distant sounds of cars, no faint hum of electricity, just us and the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around, laughing and enjoying each other's company. I had never felt more at peace. But when we decided to turn in, something shifted. That night, I kept waking up, hearing strange noises just beyond the trees. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the occasional hoot of an owl. These were softer, quieter sounds, almost like whispers. I brushed them off at first, telling myself it was just the wind, but something about the tone of those whispers felt wrong. Intimate, almost as though they were meant for someone, not just the forest. The second night, things felt different. I couldn't sleep at all. The forest had gone silent. Not the kind of silence you're used to when you're out in nature, but an unnatural, almost oppressive quiet. There wasn't a single sound from any creature. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest had been drained of all life. At one point, I decided to step out of the tent and check the surroundings. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I shone my flashlight into the woods, expecting to see some critters or movement, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I called out to my friends, but my voice felt swallowed by the stillness. Then I saw it. Something standing far off, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it didn't move like a human. Its silhouette was dark, almost blending into the night, but the more I stared, the more I felt like its presence was wrong. The air seemed to pulse around it, and I swear I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I froze, my breath hitching. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It didn't seem curious. It didn't feel human. It felt watchful in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed away, slowly retreating into the tent, my heart racing. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, but nothing else came. The next morning, my friends were awake, laughing, acting like nothing had happened. They didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the figure in the woods. When I told them, they just shrugged it off, calling me paranoid. I didn't press the issue. We packed up our gear, leaving the quiet forest behind us, still unsure of what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we were back in town that I realized something truly terrifying. I checked my phone. No service as expected. But when I scrolled through my pictures from the trip, I froze at what I found. In the photos from the night before, something appeared. A faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees, barely visible but unmistakably there. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And somehow, whatever it was, it had been watching us. I don't know what it wanted, and I never want to go back to that place. Some things are better left unseen. I'll never forget that summer evening. It was just a normal family trip, something we did every year, driving out to the old orchard just outside town. My parents, my siblings, and I. We had always gone there to pick fruit, sit beneath the trees, and enjoy the quiet, rural countryside. The orchard had been there for as long as I could remember. Rows of apple trees stretching out into the distance, their branches heavy with fruit. My family had visited so many times over the years that I hardly noticed the quiet, the rustling of leaves, or the way the sunlight filtered through the trees in that peaceful rhythm. That night felt different from the start. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink, but it wasn't just the beauty of the setting sun that was off. It was the stillness. Even the air felt thick, like something was holding its breath. We parked the car under the massive oak near the entrance, the old wooden sign creaking as the wind blew through it. My parents were excited, chatting about how many baskets we would fill while my younger brother and sister ran ahead toward the trees. I lagged behind, lost in my own thoughts. It wasn't long before I noticed how eerily quiet the orchard was. No birds, no rustling leaves. It felt like the world had been muted, as if the usual sounds of nature had been snuffed out. I glanced around, but there was no breeze, no rustling, no movement of any kind. Even the ground beneath my feet seemed strangely still. As I followed my family deeper into the rows of trees, I started to feel a creeping sense of unease. My siblings' laughter faded away, replaced by a strange silence. I could hear their footsteps ahead of me, but the normal sounds of nature were gone. The air felt too still, almost too heavy. When I caught up with them, I noticed my brother and sister standing frozen, staring at something a few yards ahead. I followed their gaze and froze too. In the distance, there was a figure. It wasn't human, but something wrong. Tall and gaunt, its limbs moved unnaturally like they were too long, too stiff. Its head tilted sharply toward us, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't moving like a person. Its movements were jerky, mechanical, almost like it didn't understand how to walk properly. It took one slow step toward us, and I noticed it wasn't wearing any clothes. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched tautly over its bones. I wanted to run, scream, do anything, but I was frozen. The figure didn't make any sound, just continued to advance slowly. My brother and sister didn't move, their eyes wide with fear. My parents were oblivious, still walking ahead, chatting like everything was normal. I finally found my voice. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Something's out here." They turned, faces puzzled. "What are you talking about?" my mom asked, but when they saw the figure, their smiles dropped. My dad's expression went blank, and my mom let out a small gasp. "Stay back," my dad said, his voice low and sharp. "Everyone, stay together." The figure took another step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't seem hostile, just wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. We all took a step back, trying to back away from it. The creature stopped a few feet away, tilting its head in that disturbing, unnatural way. Its hollow eyes seemed to be searching for something, or someone. "We need to get out of here," my dad said urgently. His voice trembled as he turned to lead us back to the car. My mom grabbed my brother and sister, pulling them along as we hurried through the orchard. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still watching us. I dared a glance back and saw it standing there, unmoving, as though rooted to the spot. When we made it to the car, My dad slammed the door shut, and we drove away as fast as we could. The figure never moved, never followed. It was just there, standing in the stillness of the orchard. I looked back through the rearview mirror one last time. It was still there, standing perfectly still, the sun finally disappearing behind the trees. Even now, I don't know what we saw that night, but whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't supposed to be in that orchard. And sometimes I still feel like it's watching, waiting, just as still and silent as it was back then. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old orchard at the edge of town. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rolling hills, and the air was crisp. We had heard stories about the orchard, about how it had once been a thriving farm, but now lay abandoned, overgrown with wild grass and tangled vines. None of us really knew what to expect, but something about the place drew us there. Maybe it was the thrill of something forgotten, something lost to time. The old farmhouse at the center of the orchard stood there, half collapsed, its windows shattered and roof caved in. The wooden beams creaked softly in the wind, as if the house itself was moaning. We parked the car at the edge of the orchard and walked deeper into the field. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, covered in fallen apples and weeds. The air smelled earthy, and there was a faint sweetness from the ripened fruit still hanging from the trees. As we approached the farmhouse, the feeling of being watched set in. It wasn't the kind of eerie quiet you'd expect. No birds sang, no rustling of leaves. It was dead quiet, too quiet. We made our way inside, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath us. The place was a mess, old furniture scattered, walls splintered, and dust floating through the air like whispers. A sense of unease clung to the room, heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just the silence. It was as if something had been waiting in the shadows for us. One of my friends, Sarah, wandered into the next room. I followed behind, but stopped when I noticed something odd. In the corner of the room, there was a chair. No, 2 chairs. Both were facing each other, but they were old, cracked, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The legs were splintered, and dust coated the seats like a film. What disturbed me most was the way they seemed to be positioned, like they had been placed deliberately, waiting for something or someone. "Why are the chairs like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, frowning. "It's creepy." We both stood there, staring at the chairs, the silence pressing down harder. I had the sudden, irrational thought that someone, or something, might be sitting there, just out of sight. As we explored further, we came across the kitchen. The cabinets were open, broken plates and jars scattered on the floor. It was here that we found the most unsettling thing of all, a photograph. It was crumpled, lying on the countertop. A family of 4 stared back at us. The man and woman smiled weakly, while 2 children sat on either side of them. What caught our attention wasn't the photo itself, but the absence of their faces. The photo had been torn, their features missing as though someone had tried to erase them. All that remained were empty eyes, hollow and void of life. "What happened here?" Sarah whispered. Her voice trembled. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. As we turned to leave, I noticed something moving outside the shattered window. A figure, thin, tall, standing in the distance just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette of someone or something watching us from the edge of the orchard. My heart pounded and I stepped back, whispering, "Do you see that?" Sarah followed my gaze, her eyes widening. I saw it too. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Its presence felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for us to arrive. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing her hand. As we hurried toward the car, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something, anything, trailing behind us. But there was nothing. The figure remained distant, still unmoving. Once we reached the car and drove away, I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror. The orchard was behind us, the farmhouse a dark silhouette against the fading light, and still I felt that unseen gaze following us. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or didn't see, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was waiting, and it's still out there. The night had been uneventful at first. I had decided to take a long drive along the old highway that cut through the desolate plains. It wasn't a particularly scenic route, just endless stretches of cracked pavement and empty fields, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional flicker of my dashboard. The quiet was almost oppressive. I usually enjoyed solitude, but this felt different, more isolated, more oppressive. As I drove, I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights of another vehicle trailing behind. But there was nothing. No other cars, no signs of life, just the endless road and the hum of my engine. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the horizon curved slightly that something caught my attention. Off to the side, barely visible beneath a thick layer of dust and fog, was an old gas station. I couldn't recall ever seeing it before, but something about it made me slow down. The building was worn, paint peeling, and the sign above it flickered weakly in the night. I decided to stop. It wasn't as if I had much else to do. My phone had lost a signal hours ago and the gas gauge was hovering near empty. Pulling into the station, I cut the engine and stepped out into the stillness. The air was colder than I expected, biting at my skin as I stretched. The station looked abandoned. Cobwebs clung to the windows, and the front door creaked ominously when I pushed it open. Inside, everything was coated in dust. The aisles were empty, shelves leaning precariously, and there was a heavy silence that pressed down on me. I checked the register. Empty. The shelves were stocked, but there wasn't a single item that looked untouched in decades. My footsteps echoed as I wandered further inside, drawn by a sense of curiosity mixed with unease. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper on the edge of hearing. I stopped, my breath hitching. The noise wasn't coming from inside. It was outside, near the side of the building, like someone was dragging something heavy across the gravel. I moved toward the door and cracked it open. Nothing but the dark stretch of road and the fog that clung to the horizon. My heart thumped harder, and I stepped back inside, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. A dragging sound, slower, heavier. I didn't dare go outside, but I stood frozen, waiting for whatever it was to come into view. The noise stopped, as if whatever had been making it had reached the edge of the building, and then silence again. I forced myself to move back toward the register. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, trying to reconnect to any signal, but the screen stayed blank. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching. I had almost convinced myself to leave when I heard a voice. Soft. Low. Hello? My stomach twisted. It wasn't like any human voice I'd ever heard. Hollow, distorted, as though the words had been dragged through something sinister. I backed further into the station, heart racing. "Who's there?" I called, but my voice shook. The silence stretched, then came the whisper again, closer. "Why are you here?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe someone was playing some kind of cruel prank, or maybe I was losing my mind. But there was no way to rationalize what was happening. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, moving with an unnatural gait. Its limbs were too long, bent at angles they shouldn't have been. Its face was shadowed, but I could see eyes, dark, hollow pits where the light should have been. I stumbled backward, knocking into a shelf. "No! No!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The thing didn't respond. It continued to move toward me, silent but relentless. Desperation set in. I didn't think, I just ran, back toward the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I shoved the door open, not even bothering to check behind me. The fog outside was thicker now, swallowing the road, the station, everything. I sprinted, not caring where I was going, only knowing I couldn't stay there. My legs burned, but I didn't stop, didn't look back, not until I found my car and jumped inside. When I glanced in the rear-view mirror, there was nothing there, just the road, stretching on endlessly. But I knew whatever had followed me, whatever had been waiting in the shadows of that gas station, wasn't gone. It was still out there, and it wouldn't stop. It was the kind of day that felt too perfect to be real, the kind of day you only ever see in old photos or travel brochures. My friends and I decided to take a trip out to a secluded beach, tucked away from the usual tourist spots. We'd heard whispers of its beauty from a few locals, but no one really talked about what else might be there. We didn't care. We just wanted the peace and quiet. The drive there was uneventful, winding through winding, narrow roads that twisted through dense forests. The radio played softly, our conversations mellow, as we joked about what kind of adventures awaited us at the shore. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We finally reached the beach in the late afternoon, the sun already low on the horizon. The sand stretched out in front of us, golden and untouched. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was soothing. For the first time in a long time, we truly felt free. We spent the day swimming, building sandcastles, and exploring the tide pools. It was idyllic. But as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the sand, something started to feel off. The beach, once full of laughter and cheer, grew quiet. The air seemed to thicken, the usual comforting sounds of waves and birds fading into silence. It wasn't that we felt unwelcome, just uneasy, like something was watching. As the last light of the day faded, we gathered our things, feeling reluctant to leave the peaceful stretch of shore behind. I was about to suggest we head back when one of my friends, Laura, stopped dead in her tracks. "Wait, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. We all stopped and strained to listen. At first, it was just the sound of the ocean, but then I realized she wasn't talking about the waves. There was something else, a faint, rhythmic thudding, soft but insistent, like something hitting the ground just beyond the edge of the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my stomach tightening. We couldn't see anything, just the dark silhouettes of trees looming beyond the beach. The sound grew louder, closer, and now I was sure I could hear another noise. Whispers. Low, unintelligible voices like they were murmuring right at the edge of hearing. "I think we should go," one of my other friends, Mike, said, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Maybe someone's camping out there," Laura suggested, but her words trembled as she spoke. The thudding noise stopped abruptly and the whispers fell silent. A sudden chill swept through the air. It felt like something had just moved, watching us from the darkness. "I think we should go now," I said, my voice firm. The fear in the air was impossible to ignore. We started walking quickly toward the car parked at the edge of the forest. My mind was racing. What could have made that noise? What had those whispers been? As we neared the edge of the woods, something caught my eye. A figure just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. It was dark, featureless, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I stopped, unable to look away. "Come on," Mike yelled from a few steps ahead. I blinked, shaking my head. The figure was gone. We piled into the car, driving quickly away from the beach. The silence inside was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. None of us spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. That feeling, the sensation of being watched, hadn't left any of us. It wasn't until we were back in town that Laura spoke up again, her voice breaking the silence. "I've never told anyone this, but when I was walking down the beach earlier, I saw something in the water," she said quietly. A face, floating beneath the surface. It wasn't human. We all fell silent. None of us had seen the face she mentioned, but somehow I wasn't surprised. What we heard, what we saw, whatever it was still there, watching from the shadows of the trees. To this day, I haven't returned to that beach, and I never will. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard, something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold, as we looked out over the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it, the soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open. But what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, we bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places I've learned are better left untouched,